In the hush before dawn, the world holds its breath. There are no birds yet, only the quiet creak of trees sighing beneath the weight of a long night, the cold cling of mist as it weaves like a living thing through crumbling stones, forgotten paths, and the wet leather of soldiers' boots lined in disarray. The sun, still buried beneath the edge of the world, does not rise quickly here. Not in these hills. Not in this country. Not in this time. It is the year 1801, and the earth drinks its fill of blood. Men die easily in the Balkans. They always have. Hills turn red then green again, like the seasons of suffering, as predictable and inevitable as rain. But here, at the edge of empires, where the Austrians leer from one border and the Ottomans rot from the other, this story is not of empires, or maps, or monarchs in gilded halls. This is the story of flesh, and the man who devoured it. He was once a name sung on the lips of peasants in Serbia: hero, rebel, savior. General Milan Petrović. A tall man with dark, thoughtful eyes and the long stride of someone born to hills and hardship. He wore a uniform stitched from scavenged cloth, sashes dyed in blood and soot, boots stolen from a Hungarian colonel he had gutted during a skirmish. But he was not born cruel. No child is. He had once loved books, it was said. He had once wept beside his father's grave, clutching the Orthodox cross to his chest, trembling not from cold but from guilt. It would be years before those same hands would twist a soldier's head from his spine to save the meat from bullet holes. The road to horror is paved in slow hunger. But first, there was fire. When the Turkish garrison at Kaprija fell, the sky turned black. Smoke poured from the narrow clay chimneys of the outpost, which the rebels had besieged for 3 nights with nothing but old muskets and sharpened hoes. The men had been hungry already. Not starving yet, but empty enough that they watched the corpses of Turks burn with the twitching attention of animals. They still remembered meat. The general stood among them, his face streaked with soot, his greatcoat torn along the shoulder. In his right hand he held a scimitar stolen from a dead janissary, its curved blades sticky with blood. He raised it high, and the rebels, his rebels, howled with a kind of joy that bordered on madness. Some were no older than boys. One, a shepherd named Stephen, still had milk teeth in his mouth. Another had never killed until this night, and could not stop laughing. But Milan Petrović did not smile. He looked past the broken bodies and scorched stone, and thought only of what came next. The winter would be cruel. And crueler still with mouths to feed and no supply line. Serbia was rising, yes, but Serbia was poor, splintered, hungry. And empires did not fall from a single siege. This victory, though painted in ash and blood, was nothing more than a beginning. That night, he ordered the food stores pillaged. The Turkish flour was filled with weevils. The salted lamb spoiled. Some of the men, too drunk with success, vomited in the mud after eating. Others swallowed it anyway, smiling with black teeth. Later, after the fire had eaten the outpost whole and the wind dragged the stench of it into the hills, they buried their dead and ate in silence. Stephen, the boy, stared too long at one of the fallen rebels. "We should have burned him," he muttered. "Why?" asked another. The boy hesitated. Then, with wide, frightened eyes, "So we don't get ideas." Before Milan Petrović was a general, he was a man. Born in a peasant village nestled between the Morava River and the low ridges of the Homolj Mountains, he was the second son of a beekeeper. His mother Yelena died birthing his younger sister. His father drank himself into the grave before Milan turned 17. Poverty did not bend him, but it carved him into something lean, quiet, and capable. He joined the Hayduks not for politics but revenge. A Turkish official had taken his sister, dragged her by the hair down the village road after her husband was accused of theft. She was never seen again. But 2 nights later, the official's throat was found nailed to the door of the mosque. Milan disappeared after that. Years passed in shadow. No one knew where he went. Some said he joined bandits in the Carpathians, others claimed he fled to Montenegro and learned to kill with knives in the dark. What is known is that he returned taller, stronger, and harder than before. He did not smile easily. He did not drink. He wrote often, in a small notebook tucked inside his coat. Poetry. Names. Orders. No one knew. By the time rebellion kindled like dry straw across Serbia, he was already a legend. And legends, unlike men, do not bleed until it is far too late. It was in Smederevo that the first rumors began. Nothing strange at first, only whispers, muttered in drink, discarded as fear or enemy lies. He feeds his dogs from the corpses. He carves meat from the fallen and sells it to the men. He never buries his dead. Milan said nothing. He rode at the front, tall in the saddle, silent. His horse was a black stallion named Gavrin, and it followed no one but him. And his men, they followed because they believed. Or feared. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference. The truth of that winter was simple. There was no food. The Ottomans burned fields as they retreated. Livestock was taken or slaughtered. Villagers were either too poor or too frightened to offer support. The rebels, once proud, fierce fighters, grew thinner by the day. Children of soldiers began to die first. Then the old. Then, one quiet morning, a young man who had collapsed from hunger while standing guard. They ate roots. Then bark. Then rats. And then, something else. No one ever saw Milan Petrović carve the first body. No one watched him cut it or roast it or offer it to the fire. But a bowl appeared. Hot. Seasoned with bitter greens. Meat, tender and clean. The young boy, Stephen, was the first to taste it. He wept afterward, not in fear, but gratitude. When they asked where it came from, Milan only said, "From a man who died for Serbia." No one asked again. There is a particular silence that follows acts beyond forgiveness. Not shame. Not guilt. But something deeper. A rupture. It cannot be named because it is beyond language. The men who ate that first night felt it settle into their bones. And the strange thing, perhaps the most terrible thing, was that they slept well after. Their bellies full. Their dreams peaceful. By spring, the general's army had doubled. They won battle after battle. His men grew stronger while others starved. Some deserted their own posts to join him. Even Ottoman scouts returned with haunted eyes and whispered of dark rites in the Serbian forests. Of a commander who fed his men from the flesh of the fallen and marched them into victory like wolves reborn. The name Milan Petrović grew heavier. It no longer meant rebel. It meant hunger. In March of 1802, he ordered the execution of 2 deserters. Not uncommon. Desertion meant death in most armies. But the way they died, slowly, limbs removed one by one while the soldiers stood in a circle and watched, was new. The general stood beside the fire, silent, watching. When the final cries faded, he spoke quietly. "This meat will not go to waste." And it didn't. They roasted it in silence. Ate in silence. Buried only the bones. There was a woman among them, once. Danica. A healer. She had followed her husband into the rebellion, sewing wounds, boiling roots, whispering prayers over the dying. She was kind. Gentle. Her presence made the men remember softness. Clean hands. A song at night. She disappeared after a harsh snowstorm trapped them for 5 days. Some say she fell into the ravine. Others say she was caught trying to flee. Her name was never spoken again. But Stephen, the boy, who had grown taller now and quieter, whispered her name one night while stirring a pot of thin stew. Milan overheard. He said nothing. Only watched. The next day, Stephen was sent alone to scout the hills. He never returned. The meat that night was tender and sweet. Still, they won. Battle after battle. Town after town. Milan Petrović became a myth in Ottoman circles. The ghoul of the Morava, they called him. The bone general. They believed he wielded sorcery. That his horse drank blood. That his men ate the hearts of Turks to steal their strength. None of that was true. The truth was simpler. And darker. They ate to survive. And then, they ate because they had learned to. Some nights, Milan would sit alone beside the fire and read from his notebook. His hands still slick with blood, his face still smeared in ash. He never looked afraid, only distant, like a man already fading into the fog of stories, where no consequences live. But consequences, like hunger, are patient. And spring was coming. So was the reckoning. The first thaws of spring arrived with a deceptive softness. Gentle breezes stirred the branches, and the hard earth bled beneath the sun like a wound reopening. Birds returned hesitantly to the forest canopy, their songs brittle, uncertain, as if they, too, sensed something unnatural in the air. To the south, plum trees bloomed prematurely, a pale violet miracle in the wreckage of war. The men of General Milan Petrović's camp watched them in silence, their hollowed eyes reflecting neither awe nor joy. The petals drifted past their boots, and none bent to gather them. Something sacred had long since been broken. The army had grown stronger, yes, lean and quick, merciless and mobile. There were ghosts in the trees, terror in the night, their ambushes as precise as any imperial army. But the laughter had vanished. The campfires had grown quieter. Each man now ate with lowered eyes, bowls clutched close to the chest, as if warding off theft or memory. And Milan? Milan wrote. He sat on a stump most evenings, boots crusted with dried blood, and scribbled in his small, weather-beaten notebook. The ink had long since run out, replaced now by crushed berries and ash. None dared look over his shoulder, but some whispered that he was writing sermons. Others said it was a record of the dead. Only one man knew. His name was Petr. A former schoolteacher from Niš, Petr had joined the rebellion with nothing but a rusted saber and an eagerness to serve a cause larger than his grief. His wife and daughters had been taken by Ottoman tax collectors, pressed into servitude, their home reduced to rubble. For months, Petr fought like a man with nothing left to lose. But his mind remained intact. He watched the general carefully, studied his movements, his words, his quiet moments beside the fire. He began to see patterns. Not just in the general's campaigns, always encircling, always starving out the enemy before striking, but in his habits, his hungers. There were fewer dead than there should have been. One morning, Petr approached him. "I've been keeping a list," he said, voice low. Milan did not look up. "Have you?" "Yes. Men who vanished. Not from battle. From camp." A pause. "You write too," Petr added. "Perhaps we write the same names." The general's pen stilled. A long silence settled between them. Wind moved through the trees, shifting the smoke of the cooking fires sideways. When Milan finally looked up, his eyes held no anger, only understanding. "They offered themselves," he said quietly, "for the cause. They knew their death could serve twice. Once in blood, once in flesh." Petr said nothing. He felt the bile rise in his throat but did not let it spill. "And if they hadn't offered?" he asked. Milan closed his notebook, stood slowly. "Then I would have made the decision for them." The next town to fall was Jagodina, a small city, built along the Belika River, once known for its artisans and markets. Now it was a hollowed shell, trembling under the boots of 100 men who no longer saw walls or windows or children as anything but logistics. Milan did not permit looting, but he did permit harvesting. The Ottoman garrison had fled days before, leaving behind only the wounded, the old, and those too slow to escape. Milan ordered a makeshift infirmary constructed in the town's abandoned church. The villagers watched from behind shuttered windows as the rebels carried the sick inside. And then, one by one, carried them out again, wrapped not in linens, but in salt and cloth and silence. Petr saw it all, and said nothing. But that night he wrote. Not in his journal, but in a letter. The first he had dared to compose in over a year. "To whoever finds this, know that we were men once. Some of us still are. But we march now behind a banner soaked in blood not only of our enemies but our own. I do not know if Serbia can be born from this darkness. I fear it already has been." He buried the letter beneath a stone in the rectory floor. Then he sharpened his blade. There were others who began to question. An old farmer-turned-soldier named Raid, who found teeth in a stew. A young rifleman named Nikola, who followed the smoke trail to a pit behind the main tent and saw something he refused to describe. Angelka, a widow from Kragujevac who had joined the army as a cook. She had once served warm bread to the general. He had complimented the seasoning. All three disappeared within a fortnight. The wind carried no cries, only the soft bubbling of pots. Milan Petrović was not mad. This much is important. He did not rave. He did not foam. He did not shriek prophecies or gouge his eyes or scratch symbols into the dirt. His madness, if it can be called that, was meticulous, cold, rooted in logic. He believed the cause of Serbian freedom was righteous. He believed an army must be fed. He believed all who fought should contribute, even in death. And once one accepts that belief, once it becomes fixed, unquestioned, then mercy is not a virtue. It is a flaw. And Milan did not believe in flaws. Still, there was one moment, small and flickering like a candle too near the edge, when the mask cracked. It happened in Kruševac, after the bloodiest victory of their campaign. They had ambushed an entire Ottoman caravan. 60 men and their guards. Horses slaughtered, wagons overturned, gold spilled into the mud like wheat. Milan had led the charge himself, cutting down a pasha with a blow so clean it split the man's head like fruit. The men rejoiced, drank, sang, ate. But Milan sat apart. Petr approached, again bold, again foolish. "You do not celebrate?" The general stared at his hands. "There was a boy," he said, "among them, barely 15. Tried to run. I shot him myself." Petr said nothing. "I told myself it was mercy," Milan murmured. "Before the men got to him." Silence. "I was wrong." The words fell into the dirt. They were never spoken again. But the war moved forward, dragging its sins like a bridal train. By the summer of 1802, Milan Petrović had become not just a general, but a symbol. Songs were sung in his name. Mothers threatened their children with stories of the bone general who came in the night. Ottoman officers demanded entire routes be changed to avoid his forests. And in Belgrade, whispers began to reach the ears of governors and foreign diplomats alike. "Something is happening in the south," they said. But no one knew what. Only that men vanished, battles were won by ghosts, and villages smelled of roasted meat long after the snow had melted. Among the few who dared investigate was a Polish physician named Tomasz Smuda, sent by the Russians under pretense of diplomatic aid. He arrived under heavy guard and carried with him journals, instruments, and a crucifix he never took off. He had heard rumors. He had seen horrors. But he did not believe what he would find. At first, Milan welcomed him. "Science will serve us all," the general said. "We are building a nation. We need doctors." Tomasz nodded, wary. He stayed for 3 weeks. Treated fevers. Set bones. Observed. And then, one night, he followed a trail of blood to the storage tent. Inside, he found not medicine, but ribs. Human. Labeled and cleaned. He did not scream. He did not run. He stood there for a long time, then walked back to his quarters and wrote one final entry. "I have seen men driven to desperation. But this is not desperation. It is a system. An order. And the general, he believes it to be mercy. I must leave. I will try to reach Zajacar by dusk tomorrow. If this is my last record, let it be known, the future here is carved in flesh." Tomasz did not reach Zajacar. His crucifix was found days later. Melted. Petr stopped writing. Not because he had no more words, but because he no longer knew whom he was writing to. Each day blurred into the next, march, strike, eat, sleep. The men no longer joked. Their songs grew darker. When one among them died, there was no mourning, only quiet calculation. What meat could be saved? What could be salted? The soul had vanished. Only the body remained. And Milan grew quiet, withdrawn. Even in victory, he looked pale, like something already dead. And in the moments when no one watched, he would run his fingers along the edge of his blade, not to test its sharpness, but as if feeling for something he had lost long ago. Something human. Then, one night in a storm, a boy wandered into camp. Barefoot. Wild-eyed. No more than 10. He carried no weapon. Only a name. "I'm Stephen," he said, voice shaking. "I came back." The men stared. The general came forward, slowly. But it wasn't the same boy. The real Stephen had been gone too long. This one had different eyes. A different voice. And yet, Milan knelt before him. "Do you remember me?" he asked. The boy nodded. "You fed me," he said softly. "You saved me." Milan touched the boy's cheek and whispered, "Forgive me." That night, no one ate. And for the first time in months, the men slept without the scent of cooking meat in the air. The boy vanished before dawn. No one saw him leave. No footsteps marked the wet earth. The guards swore they never let him pass. Some said he'd never been there at all. Just a dream conjured by guilt and the pounding storm. But Milan Petrović had not slept. And when the soldiers rose and gathered for the day's march, they found the general already mounted, his uniform dry despite the night's rain, his face drawn but unreadable. He gave no orders for breakfast. No mention of the boy. But something had shifted. They moved east, toward the Danube, where Ottoman holdouts still clung to the ridgelines and local governors begged for relief. The terrain was hard, rocky passes littered with old bones and tree stumps hacked clean for firewood seasons ago. The air grew colder, sharper, even as summer thickened across the lowlands. Fewer birds sang. The forest watched them pass, old and quiet. Petr felt it too. That something was cracking in Milan. Not loudly. Not in rage or collapse. But like an iron buckle worn thin. The general no longer walked the camp at night. No longer tasted the stew. He did not write in his notebook, though he carried it always. His eyes were somewhere else. The men noticed. And some, especially the new recruits, grew nervous. They had heard the stories. They had whispered of the Bone General and his appetite. But it had always seemed distant, the legacy of other men, older ones, veterans. Now, with Milan silent and his fire cold at night, that legacy hovered over the army like mist. There were fewer executions. Fewer missing soldiers. But no one trusted it would last. Fear had fermented in them. It was part of their bloodstream now. The fall of Veliko Gradišće came with little resistance. The Ottomans had fled 2 days prior, according to scouts, leaving behind abandoned cannons, collapsed palisades, and a handful of wounded too ill to walk. The general ordered them tended but gave no instructions for what came after. The men, unsure, waited. Petr approached the church, where Milan sat alone on the stone steps. "There are 4 of them," Petr said, barely clinging to life. Milan said nothing. "Do we save them?" Still silence. Petr tried again. "Or do we use them?" At last, the general stirred. His voice was low, hollowed out. "We bury them. And mark the graves." Petr blinked. "We mark them?" he echoed. "They are still men," Milan said. It was the first time he had spoken those words in over a year. That night, the soldiers cooked only lentils and dry bread. A strange hush fell over the camp. Some men stared into their bowls, waiting for something more. Others ate with relief. A few refused to eat at all. That was the last night they dined together. Discipline frayed. Without the rituals of hunger and obedience, the unity of Milan's army began to splinter. Factions formed, old guards loyal to the general's methods, and others who craved the meat, who now saw it not as survival but strength. Among the latter was Vakasin, a burly man from the southern marches, whose laughter always bordered on madness. He had once been Milan's fiercest lieutenant, a man who led charges with a knife in each hand and eyes that burned with righteous fury. But something in him had twisted over the months, hardened beyond repair. He liked the taste. and he liked the fear it gave him. He approached Milan one evening as the army made camp near the Black Timok. "We found meat," he said, casual, as if discussing weather. Milan didn't look up. "They were thieves," the Vukasin added. "Caught them trying to run with rations. 2 young, 1 old. Perfect meat." Milan's voice, when it came, was sharp. "No." Vukasin frowned. "No," he said. "We waste them? We bury them," Milan said. The silence between them crackled like a frost forming on the earth. "You've gone soft," Vukasin sneered. "Is it the boy? That phantom in the storm? He whispered a miracle in your ear, and now you think you're saved?" Milan stood slowly. His eyes were unreadable. "I remember what we've done," he said. "But I will not become it." Vukasin spat. "You already did." That night, Milan ordered Vukasin confined. Not executed. Not fed to the fires. Just caged. It was a strange punishment, and the soldiers murmured. Caging a man like a beast? Was that better than death? Was it mercy, or cruelty in another skin? Vukasin sat in the makeshift stockade, laughing to himself. When night fell, he sang old Turkish war songs. When morning came, he wept. Peter visited him once. "Why did you say it?" he asked. "About the boy?" Vukasin shrugged. "He came back wrong. Something was inside him." "Inside him?" Vukasin leaned forward. "He wasn't a boy. He was judgment. That's what Milan saw. And he's afraid of it." Peter left without speaking. He dreamed that night of teeth. The war rolled on. Skirmishes in the east. Raids on Ottoman convoys. Desperate treaties formed and broken by border lords with shifting loyalties. The world was unraveling faster than any army could keep up with. But Milan's men marched still. Though fewer now. Thinner. Hungrier, but not starving. The men began killing animals again. Foraging more carefully. Accepting charity from villagers without threats or violence. Something resembling a real army flickered at the edges of their formation. And Milan, he walked more often now. He touched trees. He prayed. Once, Peter saw him standing knee-deep in a river, whispering something to the current, holding his bloody hands just beneath the surface. He never asked what the words were. Then came the letter. A message from Belgrade sealed with red wax, delivered by a courier whose horse collapsed from exhaustion just after the gates. The courier had traveled 2 days without rest. The note was brief. "Austrian observers have taken interest in your methods. A tribunal may be formed. Appear before the council in Novi Sad within 1 month." Milan read it once. Then again. Then he burned it. But word spread. The camp vibrated with rumor. "They're coming for him. He'll be tried like a criminal. Is that why he stopped feeding us? Will they hang him, or cut him open and weigh what's inside?" Some soldiers deserted that night. Others sharpened blades. Some wept with relief. Peter watched Milan from across the fire, and did not know which emotion to feel. They reached the border town of Nigatin 2 weeks later. What remained of the army camped beneath the black trees outside the walls. The local governor, a Serb loyal to neither Austria nor the Ottomans, sent a peace offering: wine, cheese, a young lamb. Milan refused the wine, but accepted the lamb. The men cheered when it was roasted. The smell was rich, clean. No one looked over their shoulder while eating. It was the first honest meal they'd had in 2 seasons. Afterward, Milan stood before them. He had shaved, cleaned his coat, worn his old sash, red and gold, stained from battles past. He looked almost like the man from the songs. His voice was steady. "We have marched far," he said. "Through snow, fire, and famine. You followed me when I had no food, no country, no hope. And I led you through horror. I did not lie to you. I never will." The men watched. "I made choices," he said. "Some of them damnable. But I made them so you would live." He paused. "There are those now who would call me criminal. who say our cause is stained beyond redemption. And maybe it is. He looked up. But Serbia is not. Silence. I will ride to Novi Sad. Alone. I will answer their questions. Murmurs. I ask only this, remember what we came from. And what we became. Do not forget it. Do not twist it into glory or excuse. Carry it. Then he stepped down. And no one stopped him. At dawn he left. Only Petter rode with him. The road was long and quiet. They did not speak for hours. Not until the trees began to thin and the land flattened into plains. Then Milan spoke softly. Do you think we're monsters? He asked. Petter did not answer. Or just men who remembered too late what it meant to be human? Still silence. Milan laughed once. The boy, he said. He reminded me. Petter finally looked over. He wasn't real. I know, Milan said. But the guilt was. He touched the notebook inside his coat. All the names, he said. I never forgot a single one. Petter said. That's not mercy. No, Milan whispered. It's penance. They rode on. The river glimmered ahead. And the wind carried the scent of distant orchards, sweet, untouched. The sun burned low and red behind them when they arrived in Novi Sad. A city straddling empires, language, and law, its streets were quiet beneath the weight of anticipation. Whispers of the Bone General had preceded his arrival. Rumors rippled through taverns and churches like fever. The man who fed soldiers from their own, who marched on frostbitten limbs and fed rebellion with salt and blood. Now he rode through the eastern gate on a chestnut mare, flanked only by a single man. There were no cheers, only silence. And behind shuttered windows, the brave ones peered out and wondered, what does a cannibal general look like? Are his teeth different? His eyes? Does he smile when he sees children, or hunger? But Milan Petrović didn't smile. His coat was clean but worn. His hair tied back beneath a thin cap. His eyes, though sharp, were exhausted. The eyes of a man who had not wept, not once, but had carried the weight of 1,000 corpses across every inch of Serbia. They lodged in him like broken arrows that could not be pulled free. Petter dismounted first, holding out his hand as if this were an ordinary arrival, not a legend approaching his reckoning. Milan stepped down on his own. He didn't speak. Didn't look at the crowd gathering behind fences and walls. He simply walked forward into the waiting arms of the tribunal. They did not shackle him. Not yet. The trial was to be a quiet one, no grand court, no public crucifixion of his name. Just a gathering of military judges, advisors, and 2 foreign observers from the Austrian Empire. They convened in a stone hall above the riverbank, where gulls shrieked beyond arched windows and the walls smelled faintly of mildew and gun oil. Milan sat at the long table like a schoolbook called to account for stolen bread. His hands were folded. His uniform unstained. His gaze unwavering. The first to speak was a colonel, Serbian-born but trained in Austrian academies. You will be given the opportunity to explain your actions, he said. We expect clarity. And contrition. Milan nodded. The proceedings began. They questioned him first about the earliest campaigns, Caprija, Jagodina, Smederevo. Each battle laid bare. Each decision poked, dissected, pressed under the glass of authority and protocol. The questions were military at first, strategy, casualties, logistics. Then came the heavier ones. Why did your men never starve? What happened to the bodies? Did you authorize the consumption of the dead? Milan answered each one with the same calm gravity. Yes. And always. I did. When asked why, he didn't cloak it in excuses. The alternative was death. But at what cost to the soul of the army? One judge asked, visibly pale. Milan said, An army without flesh has no soul left to save. One of the Austrian observers, a gaunt, scholarly man named Ehrlich, scribbled notes, feverishly, pausing only to wipe sweat from his collar. Petter sat at the back of the room, hands clenched in his lap, unable to look away. 3 days passed. On the fourth, they asked about the notebook. Petr flinched. Milan drew it from his coat with slow fingers. The pages were damp from sweat. The ink bled in places. But the spine held. "It contains the names?" asked the colonel. Milan opened it. The pages rustled like dry leaves. "I wrote everyone," he said. "Every man we lost. Every body we used. Every death I permitted. You kept a log?" "A prayer." The colonel blinked. "Explain." "I wanted to remember," Milan said. "Not justify. Just remember." He slid the notebook across the table. No one touched it. Outside, the city continued. Merchants bartered in alleyways. Children played in the dust. Farmers complained about the rains. Life, as it must, did not pause for horror. But in quiet rooms, people spoke Milan's name. Some called for execution. Others exile. Some feared that punishing a man so tied to rebellion would fracture what fragile order Serbia had finally gained. That a martyr would rise where a monster should fall. The tribunal, fractured in itself, debated long into the nights. Petr was summoned on the fifth day to testify. He stood before the court, hands trembling slightly. "You were closest to him," they said. "Did he order it? Did he revel in it?" "No," Petr said. "He never reveled. But he did not stop it." "No. Did you?" Petr faltered. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." Silence. The colonel leaned forward. "And why not?" Petr looked down at his hands. "Because I was hungry," he said. "Because we all were. Because it's easier to follow a monster than become one yourself. And he gave us that option." The tribunal watched him in silence. Petr stepped back. That night, Milan sat alone in the small stone room they had given him. It was not a prison cell. There were no bars, no locks. Only a single cot, a basin of water, a writing table. His boots sat at the foot of the bed. His notebook, returned to him, rested on the desk. Petr knocked once, then entered. "You shouldn't have," Milan said without looking up. "I owed it to you." Milan smirked faintly. "You owed me nothing." Petr took a breath. "Do you think they'll hang you?" "No," Milan said. "That would be mercy." "Then what?" "Oblivion." He turned. "They will bury the story. Burn the records. Strip my name from the songs. Say I died a coward's death on the Danube. Or that I fled and vanished into the Carpathians. But they won't hang me. Not because they fear me, because they fear what it means if I'm real." He stood. "I am proof that war strips men down to teeth and hunger. And they need to believe we're better than that." Petr nodded slowly. "Are we?" Milan didn't answer. On the seventh day, the tribunal delivered its verdict. They did not speak it aloud in the square. There were no bells, no drums, no proclamations. Only a sealed letter, given to Milan by the same colonel who had interrogated him. "You are to vanish," he said. "You will be escorted to the border. You will disappear from maps, records, and tongues." Milan nodded. "Your name will die," the colonel added. "But your army will not." Milan paused. Then said simply, "Good." That evening, he packed his coat, his blade, and the notebook. When Petr came to say goodbye, he found the room empty. Milan Petrović was last seen walking east along the riverbank. He wore no insignia, carried no flag. His boots made no sound in the dew-covered grass. Some say he crossed into Wallachia. Others believe he went north, into the high forests, where no man dares follow the old Roman roads. And others still say he drowned himself in the Danube. But Petr knew better. Because one morning, years later, long after the war had ended and the bones of empire had been picked clean, a parcel arrived at his home. Wrapped in old canvas. No name. No return. Inside was the notebook. And a single line, written in Milan's careful hand. "It is not the eating that changes a man. It is the remembering." Petr burned the book. But he remembered. Every word. Every name. Every taste. The war faded from the villages faster than the men did. Smoke lifted from chimneys once more, and fields began to remember how to grow. Children were born who would never hear a shot fired in anger. But in the shadowy places between cities, in the old forest trails and broken inns and the silent corners of churches, his name still lingered. Not Milan Petrović, but the other one. The one they never wrote down anymore. The Bone General. He was no longer spoken of in strategy, or politics, or statecraft. He had become a different kind of memory, one whispered at night, one passed between children like a story too frightening to tell without laughing after, nervously. But Petr did not laugh. He had returned to his old town, or what was left of it. The schoolhouse had been burned down twice, once by Turks, once by rebels. He rebuilt it with his own hands, taught the letters again. To sons of farmers. To daughters of woodsmen. To boys who carried knives hidden in boots and girls who had seen fathers buried in ditches. He taught them words. But not all of them. Not Milan's. He never spoke that one. Not until the stranger arrived. It was the winter of 1810, 8 years since the last sighting. The snow came early that year, heavy, clinging, ancient. Wolves had returned to the hills. Food was thinner than expected. Some remembered that other winter, the long one. And the rumors. But they dared not speak them aloud. The stranger came with the storm. He wore a long coat, hooded and stitched with red thread, odd, almost ceremonial. He asked for Petr by name. His voice was quiet, measured. His boots were foreign. Petr met him at the edge of the square. "You're not from here," he said. The stranger smiled faintly. "Neither are you anymore." He produced a letter, folded and sealed with a smear of soot. No crest. Just a faint thumbprint. Petr's hands trembled when he opened it. The words were few. "I will see you one last time." Where it began. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. He knew the hand. He packed that night. Told no one. Left before the bell struck 4. Where it began was a stretch of forest by the moor of a river, half forgotten and overgrown. The place where Milan's army had camped before its first siege. Where the first pot had boiled. Where Stephen had first tasted the future. Petr walked for 2 days through snow and thorn. He found the clearing on the 3rd. And there, waiting at the edge of the tree line, was a man wrapped in a black cloak. Tall. Thin. White in the beard now. But unmistakable. "Milan," Petr said. The general nodded once. They did not embrace. They did not smile. They sat beside the old fire pit, long buried in ash and moss. No words were spoken for a long while. Only the sound of wind in the bare branches, and the river groaning with ice. At last, Milan said, "You burned it." "The book?" Petr replied. "Yes." Milan nodded. "Good." They stared at the dead fire. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Milan said. "I came only to give it." Petr looked up. "To me?" "To them." He gestured around them, as though the trees were filled with ghosts. "All of them," he said. Petr closed his eyes. He thought of Stephen. Of Danica. Of the boy who returned in the storm. Of Tomasz. Of Vukasin. Of the meat. And he said, "You don't get to decide that." Milan nodded again. "I know." The night fell cold and fast. They did not light a fire. Milan offered Petr a flask. He declined. Instead, they sat, wrapped in silence, listening to the wolves move through the snow. When morning came, Milan was gone. Only his boots remained pointed east. Petr found a small pile of ash beside them. Still warm. Years passed. The stories returned in new forms. Poems. Plays. A stage actor in Niš once performed a monologue as the Flesh General. In Budapest, pamphlets circulated claiming the entire rebellion had been cannibals in disguise. In Vienna, a composer wrote a requiem titled Asa Silentia, the Silence of Bones, dedicated to The unnamed dead of a forgotten war. Petr never responded to any of it. But in a locked drawer in his home, he kept a second book. Not Milan's. His own. A list. He had begun it after the tribunal, and though it was shorter, it bled just as dark. It began with names of the eaten. Then names of those who knew. Then his own name. Then blank pages. He would stare at them some nights, wondering who else might be at it. What new hunger might come again in the name of flags, or freedom, or God. He never wrote again. But he remembered. Then, in 1821, the snow came late. The river did not freeze. And in a village far from Petr's, a man claimed to have seen a figure moving through the trees. Tall. Hooded. Eyes like stone. He said the figure gave him a loaf of bread when his children were starving. Said he asked the stranger's name? The answer was soft, almost lost in the wind. I used to be Milan. He vanished before morning. The bread was still warm. Somewhere, deep in the mountains, in a place where no maps reach, a small cairn stands beside a frost-fed stream. Stones stacked with strange precision. On the center stone, carved faintly by blade or nail, are the words. I remembered them all. Let me be forgotten. Few pass that way. But those who do sometimes leave bread. Never meet. And the birds sing there more softly than anywhere else. The world moved on. Empires rose and trembled, borders redrawn in ink and blood. New kings ascended. Old cities burned and were rebuilt with brighter stones and fewer ghosts. Serbia itself, fractured, reborn, betrayed, and sovereign again, forged a new shape in the map of Europe. Names were honored in parades. Flags embroidered with heroes. Statues raised to men whose eyes never dulled with doubt. But Milan Petrović was nowhere. No square bore his name. No grave his stone. And yet the stories clung. Whispered in dialects that twisted with the hills and waters, tales of the general who marched an army through hell not by steel, but through flesh. Some swore he was a devil. Others, a prophet. A few, older ones, still told their grandchildren to leave offerings beneath the old trees in case the bone general walked again. Petr heard these stories sometimes. He would sit quietly at the back of market wagons or beside traveling priests, and listen as strangers retold his life like myth. He cut off a man's arm and cooked it in vinegar, said it was a lesson. No, he only ate the Turks. He had a boy, his own son, they say. He saved him from starving and turned him into a wolf. They never got it right. But Petr never corrected them. He just listened. And remembered. In 1829, nearly 2 decades after Milan's disappearance, a letter arrived at the house of a historian in Zemun. It was unsigned, dated only. From the edge of the world, written in precise Serbian script. It began with a question. What does a man become when the war ends but the hunger does not? The letter described no battles. No accusations. It spoke instead of wandering, of forests so silent they pressed into the bones. Of old wells that whispered names. Of a man who could no longer sleep without the scent of ash. I buried the book again. It read. This time not to remember, but to forget. The historian, curious and cautious, sent word to Vienna, and from there, the message spread to a new generation of officials, collectors, philosophers, and priests. They began to look for him again. But they looked in the wrong places. They searched the cities, the records, the graveyards. But Milan Petrović had become wind. Meanwhile, Petr aged. His beard silvered. His eyes clouded not from illness but from memory. He no longer taught. He spoke little, even to friends. Children grew fearful of the quiet old man who stared too long at nothing, who lit candles on nights when no saints were honored. He lived alone in a house of clean walls and few possessions. But one drawer, still locked, remained unopened. Until the night he awoke in a cold sweat. It was late autumn. Leaves lashed against the windows like fingers. And in the dark, he swore he saw Milan standing in the threshold. No coat. No boots. Just a man in shadow. Petr rose. But when he reached the door, no one was there. only a single word carved into the wood. Soon, the dreams began again. Not of battles, but of eating. Of bones split by stone. Of lips whispering prayers into steaming flesh. Each night he would wake choking out a name that never reached his tongue. Then, one day, the drawer was found open. No lock. No key. Just a notebook. On top of it, folded in four, was a single page written in a hand he didn't recognize. It read, "A man who eats to survive dies full but human. A man who eats to control dies empty and godlike. We were both. Now choose which death is yours." Petr packed his satchel the next day. He left no note. Only an unmarked envelope beneath his pillow. Inside, a single name, Veliki Lug. Veliki Lug was a village the world had largely forgotten. Small, sunken into a hill, cradled by fog and pine, it was the kind of place cartographers glanced over and never returned to. Even locals, when asked, would shrug. Old ghosts live there, they'd say. No post. No reason to go. But Petr went. It took him 4 days by foot, across roads that narrowed into trails, into mud, into silence. He passed no wagons. Heard no bells. Only once, a raven overhead, watching him with what felt like understanding. The village was smaller than he remembered. Just 7 homes. Most long abandoned. But one, near the edge of the woods, showed signs of life. Thin smoke rose from its chimney. A goat chewed listlessly at frostbitten weeds. The door hung ajar. He stepped inside. The room smelled of pine resin and salt. The walls were bare but clean. A single cot, a table, and on it, yes, the notebook. Milan sat in the corner. Older now. White-haired. One eye clouded. The other sharp. "You came," he said. Petr said nothing. "I had to see you once more," Milan continued. "Before it ends." Petr nodded slowly. "Will it end?" he asked. Milan looked toward the window. "I've tried," he said. "To forget. To fade. To eat only what grows from earth. But it follows." He opened his shirt. His ribs showed through. "I'm starving," he whispered. "But not from hunger." Petr looked at the notebook. Then at the fire. And then, for the first time in years, he asked a question that had haunted him since the war. "Do you regret it?" Milan closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Every name. Every bite. Every order I gave. Every one I didn't. Then. And no. Because we lived." Silence. Then Petr. "That's not enough." Milan's eyes opened. "No," he said. "But it's all there is." They sat through the night. 2 old men. A war between them. A silence deeper than rivers. By morning, Milan was dead. Peacefully, it seemed. No violence. No wound. Just a man who'd finally stopped remembering long enough to let go. Petr buried him in the forest, beside a tree where the bark grew in the shape of a flame. He placed no marker. Just a stone. And beneath it, the notebook. Then he set fire to the house. It burned quietly, politely. No one came. That winter was the warmest in years. In villages across the lowlands, children were born who would never hear the name Milan Petrović. But some still left bread in the woods. Just in case. And some nights, when the wind turned cold, they heard the trees creak in voices that did not belong to them. Not threatening. Just remembering. Because memory, like hunger, does not end. It only grows quiet. And waits. In the years that followed Milan's death, Petr withdrew completely from the world. He returned once more to his small village near the bend in the Morava, but only as a shadow of the man who had once taught letters and history. His house remained sealed to most, his windows shuttered even on the brightest days. The villagers, out of respect or superstition, left him alone. He lived simply. Milk, bread, water from the well. No meat. Not anymore. Some said they saw him walking through the woods before dawn, barefoot, lips moving as though in silent prayer or argument. Others said he kept bees and that their honey cured fevers. But none saw the inside of his home. None saw the fire that he never let die. It was not until the spring of 1834 that anyone came asking questions again. This time, it was not a soldier. It was a young woman. She introduced herself as Maria, 25, daughter of a merchant from Smederevo. She claimed to be writing a book, a history of forgotten revolutions. She had read a single line in an obscure Russian archive referencing the Flesh Rebellion of the South, and the name Petr had appeared in the margin beside an indecipherable note. Ask him? He knew. Petr listened without speaking. Then, when she had finished, he stood, went to the hearth, and added another log to the fire. It hissed, flared, then settled into a steady burn. He turned back to her. "If I tell you," he said, voice thin and dry, "you must not write it down." She frowned. "But I came to record. If I tell you," he repeated, "it must remain spoken, like a funeral prayer, or a curse." She nodded slowly. And then he began. He told her everything. The boy in the snow. The taste of the first stew. The way Milan had spoken of sacrifice as if it were currency, to be spent wisely, never wasted. He told her of Tomasz, the Polish doctor with trembling hands and clean boots. Of Vukasin, laughing in his cage like a man who had seen the world's final joke. Of the tribunal. The exile. The cairn beside the river. He described it all in detail too vivid for invention. Colors, smells, the way Milan's voice sounded when he said bury them, instead of use them. Maria sat frozen, her pen untouched. And when he finished, long after dusk had fallen and the candles had burned low, he looked at her with eyes that had not aged so much as hollowed. "You may not write it," he said. "But why?" she whispered. "It's the truth. It should be told." He nodded. "But not remembered." She left before dawn. The book was never published. That summer, Petr's health failed. Neighbors brought him water, bread, medicine brewed from mountain herbs. He thanked them, softly, always smiling. But he grew thinner. He began to speak to the fire. Once, a shepherd boy passing by said he heard the old man say a name into the wind. Not loudly. Not pleading. Just releasing it. Milan. On the day he died. The village bell did not ring. There was no family to summon, no priest to read his name aloud. Just a note found beside his bed, written on a torn page of an old-school ledger. If memory is hunger, then forgetting is peace. He was buried in the earth behind his home. No stone. Only a flat circle of worn grass where nothing ever grew again. The bees vanished that week. So did the fire. Years later, a child playing near the edge of the woods found a small iron box buried in the roots of an old tree. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a journal. Its pages, damp and curling, bore no name. But in the center, carefully written in black ash, were two sentences. "We ate because we were human. We remembered because we weren't." The child could not read. He tossed the book into the river. The current carried it east. The bone general did not return. Not in body. But his shape changed. He became myth, an image scratched into the walls of inns in Transylvania, or whispered among Romani caravans as a ghost who fed on guilt. In Vojvodina, an entire sect of apocalyptic monks began their sermons with the words, "And he came to eat his own, for none else remained." And in the far north, where winters never quite leave, there were stories of a man in a red-threaded coat who walked silently through forests, planting wheat and burying bones, so the ground could forget. In 1856, during the first great census of the new Serbian Principality, a clerk in Kragujevac came across a name he didn't recognize in a land registry record. M. Petrović, land owned but unclaimed. Dead or disappeared. Possibly mythological. He scratched a line through it and turned the page. In the modern era, his name has all but vanished. Historians deny him. Archives redact him. His army became statistics, his crimes anonymized, his victories credited to others. But still, if you ask the oldest woman in certain villages, or the last living child of a soldier long buried, they might tell you this. There once was a man who saved his country with fire and hunger, who remembered every death, who asked to be forgotten. And if you walk deep enough into the mountains, past where the maps end, where even trees forget their names, you may find a stone, crooked and half buried, beneath which the earth grows warm in winter. Sit there long enough, and you might smell something, salt and pine, ash and bread. And if you whisper a name, it may answer. But not in words. Only in memory. The wind moved gently over the hills, stirring wheat fields that swayed like a sea of old gold. Birds returned with spring, building homes in gutters and barn rafters. The rivers thawed. The air carried warmth again. And in the distance, on the edge of memory, just beyond the reach of truth, his shadow finally faded. The man had become silence. But silence is never empty. It carries echoes. And so, Milan Petrović remained, not in libraries, not in the cold mouths of textbooks or the hard judgment of tribunals, but in the soft spaces between things. A shape in stories not named. A missing page in official records. A void where certainty once lived. He became what he most feared and most wanted. Forgotten. Decades passed. The world changed again and again. The Balkans flared with war, broke apart, stitched themselves back together, only to tear again in fresh patterns. Names rose like banners and were buried just as quickly. Flags changed. Faiths burned. Men feasted and starved in turn. And always the cycle spun, brutal and glorious and human. But somewhere, far from the heart of it all, a boy walked with his grandfather through a narrow glade where the trees bent low, their trunks mottled with moss. The boy stopped, pointed. "Grandfather," he asked, "what's that stone?" The old man squinted. It was nothing remarkable. Round. Weather-worn. Half-buried. But something in it lingered. A weight not seen but felt. "An old marker," the grandfather said. "Before time remembered who it was for. Should we move it?" "No," the man said. "Let it be." And they walked on, leaving behind the stone, and the silence wrapped around it. Even now, when night falls in the deeper forests of the Balkans, when the moon spills silver over frost, and the trees sway as though dreaming, there is a kind of hush that descends. Not fear. Not reverence. Something older. A memory not tied to words. And in that hush, if you sit long enough beside the crooked stones or walk the forgotten roads where no signs remain, you may feel it, that thrum beneath your feet. The ancient beat of boots long disintegrated. The final exhale of a man who bore too much and forgave too little. Some say the bone general still walks. But it is not true. He sleeps now, beneath earth that has forgiven him, beneath sky that no longer watches. There are no ghosts in his wake. No judgment left to pass. Only the soft drift of time smoothing away the edges of horror until all that remains is a strange ache, the kind you feel when you hear a song with no words, or taste a food you've never eaten before but somehow remember. This is how all stories end. Not with fire. Not with glory. But with forgetting. A forgetting that heals. And a silence that feeds no more.